We are officially live for this Tactics Tuesday. And today, what we're going to be talking about is mastering manufacturing, how to maximize discounts and manage suppliers. So, for this Tactics Tuesday, you know, this is something we've been talking about for a little bit internally, but we're happy to share here as well as part of the Brand Fortress HQ podcast. So with that, Mike, I'm actually going to turn it over to you because I know that this is something that you have some experience with in kind of how to navigate working with your manufacturers.
Yeah. So the first thing that I think it's valuable for Amazon sellers to recognize, and sometimes it's not easy to make the distinction because the companies don't exactly advertise it a lot of times, and that is that especially if you're sourcing out of China, but this could be true, if you're sourcing someplace else as well. But you have manufacturers and then you have trade companies. And oftentimes, especially if you're searching on, say, Alibaba or something like that, looking for a manufacturer of a particular product that you're looking for, a lot of the companies that are listed are not actually manufacturers, they're trade companies. And the idea there behind a trade company is simply that they are selling product for the manufacturer. They're a middleman. So they work with a number of different manufacturers, and then you find them on Alibaba, they quote you a price, and obviously their price is marked up over whatever price it is that they're getting from the manufacturer. Now, it's not necessarily the case that you don't want to work with the trade, company. Sometimes they're good to work with. Sometimes they can add some actual value to the relationship. But the reality is that you are always going to be paying a premium by working with a trade company versus working directly with the manufacturer. So any research that you can do on the front end to verify whether the company that you're looking at is a trade company or a manufacturer is helpful, because if you find that it's a trade company, then at least whatever price it is they're quoting you, you can do better. Now, you might not be able to do better from that trade company, although you probably can negotiate a better price, but you certainly would be able to do better if you can actually find the manufacturer that they're dealing with. Sometimes those manufacturers will deal with you directly. Sometimes they have an arrangement with the trade company, and so they will funnel you back through that trade company. But most of the time, you can get an arrangement with the manufacturer. The interesting thing is the links that they will go to make you believe that they're an actual manufacturer. So as an example, I have a buddy of mine who went to China just recently, and he went there to meet with his manufacturers. Well, one of his manufacturers is an actual trade company, which fortunately for him, he had figured that out before he went to China. So he knew that they were a trade company. Well, he asked to meet with them to see their operation and whatnot. So they brought him to the actual manufacturing plant where his product was being produced, but it's not their manufacturing plant. So they had the owner of the manufacturing plant put their brand, the trade company's brand or company name, on the back of the building. And then, so they brought him in through the back of the building. So it was only their sign that he saw. So he sees the name of the trade company as he walks into this manufacturing plant. And then all of the employees at the plant are wearing jerseys that have the trade company's name on them, as if they work for the trade company. But what he noticed was, of course, all these jerseys were brand new. Like, they're not dirty at all. It's clearly they've never done a day of work, in these jerseys. So it was just very comical to him because he already knew it was a trade company, right? But they're trying to make it. But he ended up getting an arrangement with the manufacturer because the trade company was doing all these presentations at the manufacturing plant. And they were saying all these things that the manufacturer wasn't particularly happy with. And so he could see the manufacturer in the back, getting really pretty perturbed over the whole situation. So they ended up having a conversation. So he ended up going straight to the manufacturer and he got a much better deal. So, but the point is, you don't always know. It's not always easy to differentiate between the trade companies and the manufacturer, but the more research that you can do, whether that's actually going to China and actually trying to, gauge for yourself whether this is actually a trade company or a manufacturer, that sort of thing, the better off you are, because it gives you some leverage and it gives you opportunities to negotiate price. So I guess that would be thing one. is, I would definitely try to make sure that whether you're dealing with the manufacturer or whether you're dealing with a trade company, and make sure you're actually getting the best price that you can get, because that's the first stage, right? I mean, like that's, product cost is where, that conversation begins.
Well, and two things that I want to just touch on that you mentioned there is one, so if you're sourcing, starting with Alibaba, which still is not a bad place to start if, you kind of have an idea of what you want to manufacture. Now, of course, the days of just sourcing products off of Alibaba and flipping them on Amazon are pretty much dead. So we're not suggesting that. But with that said, it sounds like, based on what you said, is that most of the companies that are on Alibaba that are offering, these types of services, most of them are actually a trade company rather than the actual manufacturer.
I would say that's probably a good assessment. I would say the majority of them are likely trade companies. How much more than that it is, is it 60-40? Is it 70-30? I don't know. But my gut tells me that probably more than 50% of the companies that you find on Alibaba are actually trade companies and not manufacturers. And again, some of them are very upfront about that, but many of them are not. And again, there's nothing wrong with using Alibaba, as a tool for finding, manufacturers and whatnot. But just be careful that that's not the only place that you're doing your research, and that you're investigating outside of that, going to their website, like the actual websites of these companies, or trying to see if they actually have one. Maybe looking at the import records of companies that maybe aren't hiding their import records, so you can see where are they getting their products from, and is it one of these companies that you're looking at. So there are other places to get information, but just do your homework and be aware that that you might be dealing with a trading company. And again, that's not necessarily the wrong idea. Maybe it's fine, but you're probably paying at least a slight premium to go with that trading.
Well, the other thing that I want to touch base on, I know we've talked about this in other episodes, but I just think it's so important, is how much of a difference that improvement in your cost of goods makes when we're talking about making your business more profitable. So, just to make the math easy, let's say that you had a $100 product and you were able to reduce your cost of goods by, 5%. So $5 off of that product. I think what's important for people to recognize is that that $5 goes directly to your bottom line profit. So it can make a dramatic difference in, either how much money you're able to put in your pocket on a regular basis from that product, or, use that towards being, more aggressive on PPC, depending on what the strategy is for that product, or, funding additional products or, other parts of your business. So I want to make sure that we really highlight how much of an impact that even, a 5% increase in decrease in your cost of goods can have on your bottom line, and how healthy your business is.
Well, and to put that in perspective, I think it's also valuable to recognize that that's different for every company and every product, because whereas a 5% reduction in your cost of goods on a $100 item is a $5 savings, and maybe that's significant. If the bulk of the cost of selling that product to a customer, or if a large portion of the cost of that product is the actual product cost, the manufacturing cost of that product, then the more you can reduce that value, the better off you are. If, on the other hand, you're selling a much smaller, much less expensive product to produce, let's say the product that you're producing is a $5 product. And in that situation, your fulfillment fees and storage fees and things like that end up being a very large, advertising costs end up being a very large portion of the cost to your company of putting that product in the hands of a customer. And the actual manufacturing cost is a very small portion of that cost. Then it becomes much less significant. If the cost for me is $3 to produce that product and I can save 5%, well, I didn't save very much, right? I saved 15 cents or whatever it is that I'm saving, whereas my fulfillment fee on that might be $5 per shipment, and then I've got my referral fee and things like that. So put it in perspective. I think it's valuable to pay attention to where to put your effort. If you're trying to save money on the front
Yeah,
end
good
of
point.
that, of that product, sale, sometimes the emphasis should be placed on your COGS, and specifically manufacturing, but sometimes it shouldn't be. Sometimes your COGS is already very low. Most of your cost is in fulfillment or is in advertising or whatever it is, in which case then maybe that's where you need to place your emphasis. And that's not to say that you shouldn't place your emphasis in as many places as you can, that you can have a significant impact. But don't spend a lot of time trying to squeeze pennies out of a manufacturer if that product, if that's not a big part of your cost. But again, if it's a $50 product, if you're paying the manufacturer $50 to produce it, or $100 or even $40, well then, saving $3 might be significant. So just, balance that out.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, that's a great point. The other thing that I was curious is where I think that this can be challenging is especially when you're looking at, developing new products. So, what does your process look like as far as, like how many quotes do you get from manufacturers when you're trying to price out a new product? And then also, what does that look like or how do you calculate in kind of, your MOQs and that type of stuff when there's a big question mark around a new product of, what sales velocity is going to look like in that first, 30, 60, 90 days?
Well, I would say probably one thing to be wary of is spending way too much time trying to get the best price on the product. You can always negotiate that stuff after the fact, not only with the supplier that you start with, but also with other potential suppliers, and use that as leverage. So I think the important thing on the front end is, if you think that this is first of all, you should verify, like, are you trying to launch a product that's actually going to sell, right? Or at least that you have a fair assurance is going to sell, and that you can sell profitably, then I think the specific amount that you're paying the manufacturer becomes less critical. Let's say, for instance, if I know I can sell the product for $20 and I can get that product for $4 from one manufacturer, but I think maybe I could get it from someplace for $3, but I don't know as much about that manufacturer, or whatever it is. Well, then okay, maybe that dollar makes sense. Maybe I really should be looking to get that third dollar. But if I can sell the product for $40 and I found a manufacturer that'll produce it for me for $4, well then, if I calculate out what my ad expenses should be and what my fulfillment should be and whatnot, and profitability wise, I'm getting 150% ROI on that $4 product, pull the trigger. Like, go for it at $4. Like, you already are in a position where profitability shouldn't be your primary issue. You can prove out the product, see if it goes, does your launch go well, like all of those things. Once that stuff moves and you've got sales volume, well then you can go back to the manufacturer and say, look, we can buy this many products over this amount of time. I think you should be able to give us a $3, per unit price. They're going to say yes or no. If they say no, go look for other manufacturers in that space and see if somebody will give you $3. And then you can either leverage that against the original supplier if you already like what they're producing, and say, look, so-and-so will give it to me for $3. What do you do? Maybe they won't do 3. Maybe they'll do 350 or 325. If you've already got a supplier you like and the quality is good and they'll give you 350 or 325, I wouldn't be dickering and trying to get that $3 and go to another manufacturer that you don't know. Stick with the 350. You're already profitable. You're making an extra 50 cents a unit. I'm good with that. There's a lot of people who will nickel and dime that. I don't think that's probably where your time is best spent. But in terms of like a launch and starting a new product, in my opinion, if you already know that you can buy it from supplier A and you can be plenty profitable on that product, all you got to do now is just pull the trigger and let's see how it goes, see what kind of volume you get. Does the launch go well? You can negotiate that stuff after the price. Don't nickel and dime that on the front end.
Well, and I think the other piece I'm curious about is, how do you compare that to MOQs in the sense of, let's say you have a new product and, you have a manufacturer that's like, hey, we can do this product for $1, but we require you to order, 10,000 units, versus another manufacturer that says, hey, our best price on this is, $2, but our MOQ is 1,000 units.
Right. I mean, realistically, I would, if it was me, as long as that $2 price tag puts me in a position where I'm still very profitable on that product. Like, if I calculate out, like, forget the launch, because depending on your launch strategy, you may not be profitable. If you're doing post-purchase stuff and you've got a list, you could be profitable on a launch. But let's say you're not. Let's say this is brand new. You don't have a list, you don't have a community to sell to. You're going to lose money on the launch. That's a given. The question is, once you get through the launch, you've projected out what you think your sales numbers should be, how your volume should look like, what are your costs going to be. If, based on that information, a $2 price tag still would leave you with good profitability, but you can start with that low MOQ, I would go for it. Take the $2. Don't go for that higher MOQ situation, because you don't know, the launch might not go well. Now, that being said, being realistic, if you're going to launch a product, especially if you're launching it on Amazon, if you go with a low MOQ product and you choose to do the one that you can get 1,000 units on, but a good launch means you're going to be out of those 1,000 units, well, now you're kind of in a position, right? Like, I mean, you got to weigh that out, because as soon as you go out of stock, now you've got this, okay, now I got to wait for stock to come back in again. And then will I be able to actually relaunch the product after the stock out? So, it's a double-edged sword there. But there is value in considering the low MOQ option if it's a profitable scenario. And maybe it's not, like maybe one is 10,000 units for $1 and one is 1,000 units for $2. Well, just because their MOQ is 1,000 doesn't mean you got to order 1,000. Maybe you order 5,000 and maybe they'll give it to you for, I don't know, $1.75 or something, right?
Right.
It's still not $1, but at least you don't have to buy 10,000 units. You can start with 5,000 or 3,000 or whatever. So be careful, make sure that you order enough products that you can actually do a launch and still have some product left. But I still think if it's profitable at the lower MOQ, use the lower MOQ option, and then you can always negotiate later.
Yeah, a couple of great points there. I mean, the first is that how much you need in order to do a launch. Now, typically when we do this, what we look at is, okay, what are the long tail keywords that we think we can win right away that are most relevant for this product? How many of those sales do we need to make in order to get onto page one, in those first couple of weeks, and then do some math based on that. So that's what our process currently looks like. I'm curious, is there anything else that you take into account or into your calculations when you're looking at, hey, how much product should I have for this launch?
Well, I think, again, a lot of this depends on launch strategy, right? Because personally, I believe that there is a certain amount of value in being able to launch a product with minimal discounting. There are probably those that would disagree with me that launching it at high discounts is fine, and it is fine. But I actually think that Amazon will give more weight to a solid launch that's not a heavily discounted launch. I don't know that I have a ton of data to support that, except to say that our launches have gone quite well, and we don't lose money on launches. We always make money. We have very low discounting in the beginning. And so we don't, not that I don't pay attention to long tail keywords, but when we launch, we're looking at the big keywords for our category. Like, we're looking to launch so that we can actually secure positioning on those. I would say that's a tough row to hoe if you don't have a community or a large email list that you can.
I was going to say, I want to make sure people who are listening to this understand that you have a very strong email list and you've done a ton of groundwork to not only have a list of buyers, but also people that really trust your brand, which gives you a huge leg up over compared to a lot of Amazon sellers that, like you said, have to rely on, discounts or off Amazon traffic in order to really kickstart that process. And so, discounting is probably not the only way to accomplish that, but probably the most straightforward and the easiest way to get that sales velocity during
if you don't have a list of some sort of community.
Yeah, exactly.
And in that situation, I agree with you that I think you take on a lot of risk in a launch, if your strategy, if you're going to have to heavily discount and you don't have a list or a community, if your strategy is to go after the big dog keywords in that category from day one, that's difficult, and that's going to be very
Right.
costly. You're going to need much higher, like you're going to have to order a much larger, inventory on the front end to do that, because you got to sell a whole lot more units on this short keyword than you do on a long keyword to get ranking for that keyword. So you need a lot more volume on the front end. So you get buy a lot more inventory. So it's just a lot riskier. So in that situation, if you're going to have to discount, you don't have a list, and you don't have a community, I would absolutely focus on the most valuable long tail keywords you can, that you think you got a really good chance of ranking for, that don't require massive volume to do it. And let your launch be an extended process where success on this launch is we're going to nail these 6 long tail keywords. And then from there, that's going to allow us to branch off, into these other additional keywords over time. And it gives you that opportunity to be able to project out inventory and forecast sales volume and things like that. It's a lot less stressful, to go that route.
100%. Yeah. And I just want to, kind of double click on that in the sense of essentially what you end up doing is turning that launch process into 2 steps, or at least 2 steps. And that first is, hey, we're going to go after these most relevant long tail keywords in order to start driving sales. Get those, like you said, those 6, 7 keywords, whatever it happens to be, kind of depends on category and volume, et cetera, and really get a foundation for that product and have some history to make sure that we do have product market fit, and then go after, the big dog keywords once we've got a foundation built under that. Because I think the other thing that gets lost in this conversation is it's not only about sales velocity, but it's also about reviews. So, you could generate the same amount of sales velocity as another competitor, but it's going to be a lot more expensive if you have 100 reviews and they have 10,000 reviews.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's just, you got to calculate. I mean, it always comes down to how much risk are you willing to take on. I mean, that's the, at the end of the day, if you want to go after the big dog keywords and you don't have a list, then I mean, that's big risk. But okay, swing for the fence if you like. I mean, if you got the capital, but don't spend money you can't afford to lose, because I think going that route, you have a much better chance of not having a successful launch and holding those keywords, right? The chance of you holding those keywords is much, much lower against a really strong competitor and a strong field of competitors with lots of reviews and things like that, and a really high volume keywords. Chances of you keeping that ranking there is probably slim. Whereas if you go after those long tail keywords, then holding those rankings after launch is much more likely and much less costly. And then, expanding slowly into those other keywords is probably a much better long-term strategy.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other, piece that I want to make sure that gets highlighted in this process is, what is the opportunity cost of holding essentially too much inventory? Because I remember, one of the situations that I had when I started my brand, or when I was running my brand, was we ordered, a product that we thought was going to, go really well. And it actually, did for a while until we ran out of stock. And, we had like 20,000 units of packaging. And I think it took us a total of like 2 years to get through all that packaging. And really the only reason that we kept with it was because I was just too stubborn in order to throw any of the packaging away. I'm like, we are going to use all of this. And we did. Right. It took us 2 years, but we used all of it. And I just think that I keep that memory as far as like why it's so important to find that balance of, hey, we don't want to run out of stock right away, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we don't have way too much inventory, because there's not only the cost of, right away of tying up your capital, but then, your storage fees and everything else that's involved in having way too much inventory for a product that's just not selling at the velocity that you need it to.
Yeah, for sure. Storage fees rack up, man. I mean, there's no question. We had a scenario where we ended up, in that boat. there wasn't a whole lot that we could have done about it, but we still ended up there. And it was basically COVID related because, you know, we we thought we were ready for the season. Then the season spiked super hard, you know, for COVID. Everybody was putting in swimming pools and all this stuff. And so all this inventory got purchased. Well, then not only did inventory spike, so we ran through the inventory we had, but then because of all the shutdowns and everything in China, everything got backed up. Well, we had lined up a bunch of, you know, container loads of shipments that were supposed to come in, you know, over the course of the season so that we would be ready for the influx for this season. We really thought we were ready. Well, then, so we sold through all the inventory, we ran out of stock, and then we had this wait for inventory to get produced. Well, then they just were producing like mad. And so all this inventory came in like bang, 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 bang. And we had been out of stock. So then it took us a little while to ramp back up again.
Yeah.
We had like 20,000 units sitting here in the US, and it took us forever to go through that inventory because it took us so long to get back up to our sales volume before that. We literally just sold through the remaining inventory not too long ago, to be honest. And we paid storage on that for a long time. We were lucky because we have a staging warehouse in California that really does really good by us in terms of storage fees. So we got lucky on that, but it does add up. And when you talk about the opportunity costs, that's a huge thing. If you have cash tied up in inventory that's just sitting there that you think is going to sell, but you don't know for sure, and you don't know always for sure how fast, then what are the other things in your business that you can't do because that money is tied up and sitting there waiting for that inventory to sell? What PPC ads can't you run? What offsite, you know, advertising can't you do? What other product launches maybe are you not yet ready for because you don't have the cash flow to supply, you know, the inventory for it? You know, what kind of partnerships? There's so many opportunities that come along if you're looking for them. Most of them require financial inputs that you have less of because you have this tied up. And so then you end up having to take out loans, you know, so that you can actually take advantage of that, which now has you leveraged further because you still don't know if that inventory is going to sell, right? So, and now you got this loan sitting out there. And if this inventory doesn't sell, then where's the money going to come from to pay off the loan? Because you're taking advantage of this new opportunity. And again, most opportunities as entrepreneurs that we take advantage of, we don't always know for sure they're going to work out. You know, you end up leveraging yourself really badly. So managing your cash flow and making sure that you've got good ROI, not overbuying, you know, like those are some pretty important things if you want to be in business long term. You might be able to get away with it short term, but eventually it's going to burn you.
Well, kind of along that lines, I think that's a great transition into talking about with manufacturers negotiating terms. So we talked about price. We talked a little bit about MOQ. I feel like one of the other areas that maybe doesn't get as much attention, but can be just as important, if not more important, is negotiating, you know, whether it's 60, 90 days, whatever that looks like as far as terms. For the folks that are, you know, either watching or listening, what advice do you have for negotiating terms with manufacturers?
Well, I think first of all, recognizing that most manufacturers that you deal with can probably offer you terms of some sort, right? And they'll tell you they can't. They'll tell you it's not possible. Like they're never going to just give in to that. You're going to have to fight them on it. There is a company, governmental organization, like in China, it's hard to separate the two necessarily. Quite frankly, sometimes in the US, it's getting hard to separate the two also, but we'll focus on China. So, but there's a company called, I don't know how you pronounce it, Sinosure or Sinosure or something like that, I believe it is. But essentially, it's an insurance company, and they insure manufacturers against default by a brand. You know, so like I place an order. It's insured, or at least a portion of it is insured by the Sinosure company, so that if I renege and I don't pay, then the manufacturer doesn't get stuck with the entire bill of having produced that, and they don't, you know, they're not stuck with all of it. It's not 100% insured, but it does insure it to a degree, and so it gives them a certain level of ability to write that off a little bit if something were to happen. So a few things is true. First of all, if you have a long-standing relationship with your manufacturer and you have always paid your bills on time, you've never not paid, then they already have sufficient reason to believe that you're going to pay, whether you have terms or not, whatever, like you're going to pay. So, them providing you product without getting paid up front should not be that difficult of a proposition for them to accept because you've always paid. Now, add to that the fact that they can be insured against a certain amount of loss if you don't. There's really no reason for them not to take that on. Now, there's a process, there's some paperwork that you have to go through, and sometimes they don't like having to do it, but I would push for it. And generally speaking, if you can't get, so terms is a funny thing because you can negotiate it a lot of different ways. It can be you don't pay any deposit up front, and then you pay a certain amount when the product is when manufacturing is complete, and then a certain amount when it ships from the port, or maybe when manufacturing is complete and then when it arrives at port in the US. Like, you can negotiate your terms in a lot of different ways with a manufacturer. You could have a small deposit up front and then a certain amount of additional money paid when manufacturing is complete, and then another amount of money paid when it comes into the States. Or when manufacturing is complete and then 30 days after or 60 days after manufacturing is complete. That's where your net 30, net 60, that sort of thing comes into play. So just recognize that there's not really a set way to negotiate that. Just what's better than what you have now. If what you're doing now is paying 50% up front and the other 50% when it's manufactured, well, then anything better than that is going to help your cash flow. So if you can change that to 25% deposit or 15% deposit or even no deposit, like that's possible. Like, you can get no deposit, but even 25% deposit and maybe 30% when manufacturing is complete, and then or let's say 20-30, right? And then 50% after 30 days or after 60 days. That is a massive improvement to your cash flow in terms of where you can use that money because it's not tied up so early in the process. Because again, remember, it's shipping overseas. If you're using, container shipping so that you can get better rates, like, it can be 30 days before that product that even shows up at port. It could be another 2 weeks or more before it ends up in Amazon's inventory and is actually ready to sell. So if you can get 30 or 60 days after manufacturing, that's massive. But again, any improvement over what you're doing now is going to improve your cash flow. So even if your negotiation doesn't get you to where you want to be, if it's better than where you are, then it was worth it.
Yeah. And I think for people that want some more ideas on how to negotiate that and, what those options look like, I know our episode with Ben Leonard, we discussed that as well. So there's Ben had some great tips on kind of negotiating terms with suppliers and kind of chunking those out, not only in, number of days, 30, 60, 90 days, whatever it happens to be, but then how much, pay up front and those other things. The other thing that I would add to that is, just based on, my prior experience now, I was sourcing ingredients and working with US manufacturers. So the two things that I learned out of that was, one, manufacturers don't have the best customer support. So don't be surprised if it takes multiple phone calls in order to get the right person on the phone. And, that negotiation takes time. The other thing that I would add is that know kind of where you are in that pecking order. So if you are, one of their smallest buyers where, you're doing 10,000, 100,000, whatever it happens to be, even $1 million a year with them, where their average buyer is doing 10 million or 20 or 50 million,
right?
Know that you're going to have less negotiating power, and that might be okay. If they're the ones that are able to provide the capability you need at the MOQ and some of the other things that we talked about, but just understand that when you're negotiating of kind of where you are in that pecking order, because that'll give you a much better indication of how much you can push with that manufacturer to get better terms. And then I would also, think about any way that you can frame that as a win-win. Because at the end of the day, I mean, most of these manufacturers, they want you to do well because the better you do, the better they do. So, use that as your framework when you're discussing these, terms and, 10% payment up front, 25, whatever it happens to be, and explaining to them like, hey, freeing up this capital allows us to, get more inventory into the system, which allows us to sell more, which allows us to order more and to continue to grow and order more from you, the manufacturer. So,
Well, and I would say discuss, first of all, I wholeheartedly agree with that. You always want to frame it as a win-win for sure. And recognize that manufacturers know manufacturing.
yeah,
They don't know marketing. They don't know necessarily, they're not good at that. Manufacturers are not good at those things. That's why they're manufacturers and
yeah,
not brands. So, you know, framing that conversation as a win-win, you actually should go into detail about what that looks like. So when you're talking about, if if you can free up that capital for me by giving me those terms, that means now I can advertise more. That
mm,
means I can bring on maybe more team members. That means I can, all of the things that you could tell them, and I mean, true things, don't lie to them, but I mean, if it's actually true that if you had that money, you would invest more in marketing, or you would invest more in team members, or you would invest more in whatever that is, anything that would move the needle forward so that you could sell more volume of product means you're going to buy more volume of product from them, which means they win. So frame it that way. If you give me terms, I can do these things, and by doing those, I will sell more product, which means I will buy more product. That is the best way to frame that conversation. I think it's absolutely true that you need to frame it that way. I think it's also true, going back to the question of where are you in the pecking order. A perfect example: we went to China to visit our manufacturers. We have two, and one of them, we are probably one of their smallest clients, or at least a fairly small client in comparison to what they have. They service Walmart, Lowe's, Target. Like they're selling hundreds of millions of dollars in product every year. We are one of their smallest buyers. So we are not high in the pecking order. Now we have a good relationship with them, and we did manage to negotiate some terms with them. So it's not as if just because you're low in the pecking order that you can't negotiate terms. You can. Just know where you stand. We had to push. It wasn't, they didn't just give it to us. We did have to push on that. And maybe we wouldn't have gotten it had we not visited the actual factory and formed that relationship. So it's a thought. You may spend a few $1,000s traveling over to China to meet with your manufacturer, but think about how much money you might save if you can get better product costs, or you can get better, terms so that you've got more cash flow. It might be worth that few $1,000s to go visit your manufacturer. But then secondarily to that, if this manufacturer won't give you terms, well, there are other manufacturers that produce that product, or that could produce that product. Maybe you go to a somewhat smaller manufacturer for whom you won't be so low in the pecking order, and you could negotiate terms, because in this situation, you already have a manufacturer. There's no reason for you to leave that manufacturer and go somewhere else unless they can offer you better terms or a better price, or both, than the manufacturer that you're that you're already with, that you're fairly happy with. So you have a lot of leverage there. If they want your business and you would be a fairly large client for them, they might be very willing to offer you those terms, or offer you better pricing, or even both, to get your business, because they know the only way they're going to get you is if they offer you those better terms and whatnot.
yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think the other thing that we have on here that maybe we haven't talked about too much, but let's say that you do launch that product, it's going well, and now instead of ordering 10,000 units at a time, you're ordering 20 or 30 or 50,000 units at a time. I think that's the other thing to keep in mind as well, is what are those scenarios where you should renegotiate, and recognizing once you've got you're able to order in larger batches, that you should look at renegotiating, or at least asking about price discounts from that manufacturer that may not fall neatly into kind of the categories that they give you.
Yeah, for sure. Just because they've given you pricing tiers, in terms of volume, that doesn't mean that you can't negotiate something different. Almost always you can. And again, if you originally went with manufacturer A because you could get 1,000 unit MOQ, and you didn't go with manufacturer B because it was a 10,000 MOQ, but you're now selling enough that you could buy, let's say even 8,000, right? That's pretty close to 10,000.
Yep.
You could connect with that other company. Just because they said their MOQ is 10,000 doesn't mean it actually is. Most cases, they would go less than that if they thought you would be a good customer for them. So don't be afraid to connect with a company that maybe you're not quite ready for their MOQ, but maybe you're close. They might go for it. But the reality of the situation is, again, we were talking earlier, if the one was $2 a unit, but they had 1,000 MOQ, but the other one's $1 a unit, at 10,000 MOQ, that's a pretty significant drop in pricing for the product. You should be negotiating for that if you're anywhere close to being able to order that 10,000 MOQ. Reality is, if it's $1 a unit and you're paying $2 a unit to the other company and you're buying 8,000 units now, well, you could easily afford 10,000 units at $1 a unit versus, $2 a unit. So, don't be afraid to revisit that, on a semi-regular basis. If your volume's increasing, you should be revisiting that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the last item that I have on here before I wrap up is talking about shipping. I know we've talked a little bit about SKU drop before, but when we talk about manufacturing and kind of that cash flow situation, how do you think about factoring shipping into that process?
Well, I'll tell you right now, the thing for us that is actually most critical with that, and from the sounds of things, a lot of other Amazon sellers are running into the same problem, and it may be a temporary blip, but the problem is it comes up. Like we've had this blip come up on multiple occasions, and that is Amazon struggling with getting inventory actually brought into the warehouse. The number of shipments that we have sent in over the last 2 months or more that have been delayed, rescheduled, canceled, or Amazon brought the inventory into their system, but then it just sits in purgatory and doesn't actually end up in our sellable inventory for 2, 3, 4 weeks. That's a problem. And that wraps up your cash, right? Again, you have money tied up in that product, but you can't sell it. So any of those bottlenecks that you run into along the way are problems with your cash flow. And so accounting for those and making up for those is an important piece. And one of the things that we are recognizing at this point, for whatever reason, is the shipments that are coming directly from China straight into Amazon FBA are going in much easier than shipments that are coming from someplace in the US and shipping into Amazon's warehouses. I don't know why. They're courting Chinese sellers. I don't know, but it's true. And so SKU Drop is a service, again, that we've discussed before, but they have warehousing that you can utilize in China. They will be your staging warehouse in China, and they will ship directly from SKU Drop into Amazon FBA. They are also setting up new systems where they will ship directly into other 3PLs, and their shipping costs are exceptionally good. Even sometimes shipping in smaller quantities at a time. So you don't tie up so much inventory on the water at any given time. You could have weekly shipments, or every 2 weeks you could have a shipment going, so that if one of them gets tied up in the port or one of them goes down in the water or whatever it is, you're hedging your bets. You have more shipments running through and it's just a continuous cycle. But again, they're going straight into Amazon FBA and they're not getting held up. And so even though you're bringing it in from China and there's something in your head that says I should just have this stuff sitting in a warehouse in the US, yes, you should probably have that. You should have some inventory at a staging warehouse in the US just in case. But I would be really investigating SKU Drop as an option of getting your product into Amazon's warehouses much faster than trying to get it in from domestic locations. For whatever reason, it's not getting held up. And again, if you can send in those smaller shipments, then you're not tying up as much of your money at a time, in shipping and product costs, because you don't necessarily have to order in as large quantities even from the manufacturer. You could, a lot of manufacturers, like let's say their MOQ is 10,000 units, right? In reality, what they really want is just they want a steady stream of orders. They want a certain number of orders coming in from a customer, right? And they're expecting like, okay, you order 10,000, but maybe we're not going to get another order for a month or 2 months, or 3 months. Well, what if you tell them, well, I don't want to order 10,000 units at a time. I'd like to order 3,000 units at a time, but I will order every week or every 2 weeks, or whatever it is, right? I'll order this, you make it, who bring it in, to SKU drop into their warehouse. It doesn't cost you much to domestically ship that product from the manufacturer to SKU drop, and SKU drop doesn't charge that much for storage. And then you can ship in these smaller quantities. So then again, you don't have as much money tied up in one big 10,000 unit order. You can buy 2,000 units, 2,000 units, 2,000 units. So again, it just helps with that cash flow.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize, and I know we've talked about this before, is that we don't have any connection with SKU Drop. It's just a service that we've had a good experience with. There are other services out there that do similar things. It's just that SKU Drop is the one that I know, Mike, you have had experience with, and that we've talked about here because they've worked well. So
yeah, for sure. I don't have
not the only solution out there for this, but it is at least based on our discussions, a good solution for what we're talking about.
And the only one that I have experience with. So I'm going to mention them, but yep.
Okay. Well, as we kind of wrap up this episode, what is maybe, one action item that you would leave for listeners as they think about, kind of mastering their manufacturing and maximizing, their cost of goods from manufacturers and managing their supply terms?
Well, I think, again, just like with anything else, when it comes to the idea of solving, let's say, problems within your business, you need to figure out what the biggest problems are. And if expenses is where you're focusing, then the question is, where are your largest expenses by percentage? And which of those expenses are the ones that would be easiest for you to dial in? If your COGS, and specifically your manufacturing costs, are a large portion of the cost of getting that product into the hands of a customer, then that's probably an area where you want to place some significant focus and try to see if you can get that cost of goods down, cost of manufacturing. If the shipping costs are what you're eating, then focus there, and maybe SKU drop is an option or something like that. So I don't want to make it sound like the first thing you should do is focus on your COGS today because we did this episode, right?
Right.
That's not necessarily true. Maybe COGS isn't where your problem is. Maybe your COGS are great. And maybe other expenses are where you really need to dial things in. But if COGS is a problem, then I think then the question becomes, okay, is it the manufacturing cost? Is it a matter of how much I'm paying for the product? Or is it a matter of how much I have to pay at one time and that I'm tying up in terms of my cash flow? Because those are two different things. Maybe I'm willing to pay a little bit more for the product, per unit, if I don't have to tie up as much of my money at one time. So again, differential between two manufacturers. Maybe one of them is going to charge you $2 per unit, but they won't give you terms. Maybe another one is going to charge you $2.25 a unit, but they will give you 60-day terms. Well, maybe the cash flow is more important than that, small differential in price. So don't get yourself locked into one perspective on how you need to save money. Maybe it's not a matter of saving money. Maybe it's a matter of saving on cash flow so that you have that money, available to do other things. So just don't get yourself pigeonholed into one way of looking at this.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. And I mean, I would leave listeners with just kind of reemphasizing that and looking at, if you've never renegotiated with your supplier, thinking about those different levers that you can pull. It's not just about price. It's also about, what are your terms and what are your MOQs and what does that, process look like? Whether it's, 60-day terms or chunking out those payments. There's a number of different levers that we've talked about here that you can use in order to, put more money into your pocket at the end of the day, but also to free up cash flow, which just gives you, more opportunities that you can take with your business as you work on, building your brand.
And especially if you're working toward an exit, cash flow is a big deal. Anybody who's looking to buy your business, cash flow is going to be huge. So make sure you've got that dialed in for sure.
Perfect. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap for today. And we'll be back next Tuesday for anybody who's interested. If you want to get your questions answered live, we are on LinkedIn next Tuesday, where we'll have some Q&A in order to answer your questions live.